Hey everyone, welcome to day 8 of the Django Bootcamp. We've covered a lot of things. Today is going to be pretty packed, not as packed as yesterday, hopefully, but it is going to be pretty packed itself. So the agenda is really simple. Just welcoming you now, and we're going to go ahead and code. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look here. Now, what we want to do is handle our static files and actually have our products being able to be downloaded and uploaded, of course, right? So what that means is I want to have a location to store my static files, that is assets that are like CSS, JavaScript, and images, all of the things my project might need to have a better user interface. That's what static files are. And we set that inside of settings.py, and there's a section, towards the end of it that actually talks about all of these static files. So we are going to be setting this up. Then what we're going to do is set up another location for our media files. These are files that are generally public data, right? So like a user profile is a good example of a media file where you can upload it. And of course, a product image is also a good example of a media file. And then we're also going to have protected media. That is the actual product content itself that is protected. Now, we're not going to actually initially have it protected, but we will show you exactly how to download it as well. Download any sort of file that you need, but specifically downloaded a protected file as well. So that's kind of the point of this, is that users on this e-commerce will be able to purchase digital files as well as shippable products. So let's go ahead and take a look. Now, inside of settings.py, this is where we need to set all of our locations for where we're going to store everything. So in my case, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to make 2 new folders inside of the root of my project. The first one is just going to be static files. So static files are literally any sort of HTML, or rather CSS, JavaScript, or images that are related to something we might need in our template. Not every project needs these kinds of things, right? So not every project uses CSS, not every project uses images, and not every project uses JavaScript, but the vast majority of them do. So this is actually going to be the location where we store it locally. So if you did have CSS, let's say for instance in here we put a new folder in here called it CSS and like main.css, we could say, all of our H1s have a color of red, right? Very poorly written CSS, not a great CSS file itself. There's not a whole lot going on here, but the general idea is important for what we're going to be doing. So we need to actually declare where that location is. Now, the default setting is called static files dirs, and this is going to be equal to the location of that folder. So that folder's location is in the base directory and in static files. Now, if you're familiar with OS path, it's really just as simple as ospath.join the string of that base directory and static files. You use string to turn any sort of path lib into just the string of what the path might be. So that's that location. It is actually very, very similar to how templates work. So if you do have static files inside of any given app, you can do that as well. But instead of using static files, you would say static. That's essentially where you'd put it. I'm not going to be doing that at this point, but that would be how you would go about doing roughly the same thing as the templates. But anyway, so now we've got main.css in here. And so what I want to do is actually send these static files somewhere else. Okay, so this kind of seems maybe not that intuitive, but Django itself should not be serving static files. So the static files being whether it's your project uploaded files or a user-generated uploaded file, with one huge exception, which is going to be the actual product file itself can be served by Django. But the vast majority of your CSS or JavaScript, you're not going to do that in Django. And if you're not super familiar with what I mean there, no worries, you'll see what it does in just a moment. Now what we want to have is something called a static root. Now the static root is actually where we're going to be serving the files from. Now, when we're actually testing these things out, static root can be anywhere on your local system. It doesn't actually matter where this is. In the long run, you're going to want to use something like AWS, that's Amazon Web Services S3, and maybe with CloudFront. This is definitely something I cover on my website. So if you go in my courses, cfe.sh/courses, there is something called Dive into AWS S3 that does exactly all of that. And then also the Google Cloud Storage is another place to actually store all of your static files. And honestly, there's something called Django Storages, which I'm not going to cover in this one. But Django Storages makes it pretty easy to work with these two things for Django. But there's additional like configuration stuff that you'll need to do here. Now, I'm spending a lot of time on this mainly because it's really important to have your static files not served by Django. Some people recommend using white noise. This is another way to serve your static files. I do not recommend doing that. I recommend using one of these two options. It's really inexpensive to serve your static files from there. CloudFront adds a little bit more of an expense, and if you have a ton of traffic, then you're going to have to learn how to monetize that traffic, so your static files still don't cost very much. But either way, very, very large production applications use these as well because of the scalability of the pricing there. Okay, so back to it. Where are we going to actually put in this static root here? Well, I actually am going to just create another folder inside of my application here. And I'm going to call this CDN. Oops, let's put it in the root of my project, not inside of static files. And I'm going to put this in here, and we're going to call this CDN test. Now, this stands for Content Delivery Network Test. It's meant to show you that this is not something you should use in production. That's just generally the idea here, not in production.txt. I'll just leave that in there too, just so you remember, definitely do not use this in production. So that also means that I can actually just use that as a directory that I'll be using going forward, and we'll go ahead and say CDN test. Now, in my case, I actually want to put it in another folder called static. Okay, so the reason for this is in my CDN, once I actually go into production, I will have a few different folders in here. For S3 and Google Cloud Storage, you might have one main bucket and then subfolders inside of that main bucket. No worries if you don't follow what I mean by there, but it's essentially we want to have it separated out, mainly because the next part, which will be instead of static root, this is going to be media root, and we'll call this media. So this is like any file field upload goes here by default, right? So by default. So what I also want to have is a protected media location. Okay, so yet again, I'm going to be pushing it into the base dir here with the CDN test and something called protected. Okay, so now I have several places where I can end up storing files. I also want to actually declare a media URL being equal to /media. I'll show you what these media URLs do in just a moment. But now we have all of the different locations we are going to be storing our 3 different kinds of files. Right, so again, these are like Django and app-related files. These are user-uploaded files, and these are also user-uploaded files, but these are ones that nobody else can get, right? That's kind of the goal here. So I'm going to go ahead and say if debug. So if we're in the debug mode, which is what we've got here, I'm going to go ahead and create all of these files, right? So, or all these folders rather. So static root and make mkdir and parents equals to true. And exist okay equals to true. This is very similar to os.make dir. It's very similar to dirs and then the actual path itself, but this is using pathlib, of course. So we're going to do the same thing for all 3 of those folders. And this is so I can delete this at any time and refresh and rerun everything. Obviously, in real life, or in production especially, you only really need to do this once. But I do want to make sure that those things actually exist. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and see if our server is running. I'm going to go ahead and run it again. And what I should see is those 3 folders being created here. Again, you could do this manually if you like, but when in doubt, just make sure that those folders are created. Okay, so now that we've got that, what I want to do is actually run a command called collect static. So we're going to close out this server. And remember, in my static folder here has nothing. This static files directory has just main.css inside of a folder called CSS. So if I do python manage.py and collect static and hit enter, this copies a bunch of things to my cdn test static, right? It copies them to this static root here, which it will also copy them, assuming permissions are correct. It will also copy them to these production places if you have them and set up. So what we see now is inside of that static folder, we have something for admin and just our main CSS. Now, what is this admin folder? What's going on here? Well, this is literally coming from the Django admin application. Remember how I said you can actually put that static folder inside of any given app? The same thing is true here. So then when you collect static, it's going to go through all of your installed apps, looks for static files, and it will bring it over into this static folder on your CDN, or rather into the static root as to where that's going to end up being. So this right here is for internal use. This right here is for external use. Okay, so when we actually upload a media file, it's going to go in there as well, which we will see in just a little bit. So now, since we are in the debug mode, as in we're in development mode, I'm actually going to serve these static files through Django. Again, you do not want to do this anywhere else. So let's go ahead and import it into our urls.py here. I'm going to go ahead and import from django.conf. We're going to import the settings module. And then with the settings module down here, or one more import actually. So I'll go ahead and do from django.conf.urls.static. We're going to import static. So this is a setting that we'll be using to actually serve our static files. And we'll go ahead and say if, at the bottom of this, we'll go ahead and say if settings.debug. And this is going to be, oops, I don't need that. This is going to be URL patterns. So I'm going to append to the URL patterns, which is this right here, right? So I'm just appending to that because we're still in debug. We're going to go ahead and use the static call that I just imported here. So what this is going to do is serve my static files from settings.static URL, and document root is settings.static root. Okay, so again, going back into our settings, static URL is this right here. So this is giving me a new URL on my local server for static, and it's going to go based off of what's inside of this folder here. Easy enough. And we can actually copy that same thing for media URL and media root. Okay, so there we go. Now these names, except for protected media, static and media names, all of those are built in to Django by default. So that's absolutely how you'll have to go about doing it. So the next thing is actually using one of these static files in a template. Now, this is actually pretty simple, but it's something that you might forget from time to time. So in base.html, what I'm going to do here is right above my doc type, I'm going to go ahead and load in static. So this actually loads in third-party template filters that you might need. All right, so static is one of those examples where not every actual template file will need to use static, so it doesn't actually work very similar to request. We actually have to bring it in with load static. So in here now, I'm going to go ahead and say link real equals to style sheet, and href is equal to, well, what do we actually put it equal to? Well, it's going to be our static URL. So before I get into the actual static URL, the hard way of doing it, the manual way, is to say /static/css/main.css. Now, of course, the reason for this, the reason I know that this works, there's several reasons. One of them being that this is the static folder, so that's the root of the static URL. So that's kind of this right here. And then we've got CSS, of course, that's that folder, which is that. And then main.css, of course, which is that. Okay, so that's the hard way of writing it. And let's go ahead and see if that actually works. Now let's go ahead and run the server. Hopefully there's no bugs. In this case, there are none, or errors rather. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my home page. and I don't have anything on my homepage. So going back into my URLs, what is it that we put as our homepage? We just did template view as view. Okay, so inside of base, I'm going to go in this content here, and I'll just say hello world. Of course, we will be changing that in the future, but as we see now, hello world is there. Okay, and it is red. And the reason it's red, so if we go and inspect the element here, the reason it's red is because of main.css. And if we look at the template, we see that, hey, static CSS as main is running. And if we open this into a new tab, also running. No surprise there. And of course, all of that has to do with these URLs in here. So if I actually commented this out and ran it again, I might have cache for it. Like the browser actually caches these things. So in this case, it's not wanting to prevent that from running. And perhaps debug mode is doing this by default. So I'm a little confused as to why that should not be showing up at this point. So let me just show you this by going away from debug mode and saying false for debug mode. And I'll just give a star for all allowed hosts. And let's run the server again. And now if I refresh in here, now it's telling me get not found. Okay, so that proves that, yeah, that's only for the static or the local development of our application. Cool. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and do the right way of using those static files. So going back into base.html, I loaded this static in here, but then I hard-coded the path as to where this is. Now, if I were to go into production and have this on AWS S3 or Google Cloud or anything like that, this is actually not the preferred method of doing it. Instead, what you would do is use that static tag and give a relative location for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and just use single quotes here. Okay, so now what it's doing is actually going to go based off of where it's actually being served from. So in production, it will go off of whatever the static root is and that static URL. So both things work really well for at least my local development. And of course, this changed only slightly. Actually, it didn't change at all. What am I saying? But it will change if for some reason your static CDN is different. So that's pretty simple, I think, to actually getting static files up and loading, right? But now what we want to do is actually see how to use media root, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into products models and I actually want to have a photo here. So I'm going to go ahead and say image equals to models.file field, and I'm going to declare an upload to location, which we'll see what that does in a moment. And I'll just go ahead and say products. And I'll also allow null being true and blank being true. Okay, so what's happening here is it's not actually uploading the file. It won't upload the file to your database ever. What it will do is upload a location to where that file is. So it will denote where that file is so that Django knows how to locate that file. And that is going to be stored in our, our media URL server, which doesn't have to be where the static files are. So it's going to be in here. So this media root part, that's where it's going to end up being stored. But again, it's not necessarily where the static files are going to be. So you definitely can have those separate. And in some cases, you will want them separate. So now that we've got this file here, I can run my migrations and do all that. But there is another field that you'll probably see on the Django documentation, and that is image field. Now, image field requires you to install Pillow, which is the Python image library. So let's go ahead and do that first. So source bin/activate and pip install Pillow. Now that's just a requirement that this specific field has because it is an image field. But Pillow, or the Python image library, is incredibly common to use, right? So let's go ahead and now run python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py, migrate. Now you actually don't have to use the image field. The image field does give you a few options that are related specifically to images. Like you can set another field based off of the height and width of this image, which is kind of nice every once in a while. But in most cases, or in a lot of cases, just using the file field will suffice. But image field also gives you some validation on the extension of the image itself, so that it's like JPEG or GIF or PNG, something like that. Cool. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. Ooh, I see a warning saying about no sound. Can everyone hear this? I think so. I'm not getting very many warnings from most of you about sound. Maybe there's a bad connection for one of you. Anyway, so back to this. Now what we've got is this image in here. We actually added it in. So let's go into the admin and see how it's done just by adding it in here. Okay, so oops, let's run the server again. So python manage.py, run server. Cool, looks like everyone's saying sound works. Great. Okay. So in our products, I'm going to create a new product. I did delete my old database because I was doing some tests, but now we're going to go ahead and just grab an image here. And hey, what do you know? Day 8 of the Django Bootcamp will be the image, and we'll say day 8. And yeah. Okay, so obviously I'm putting an image in here. If I try to navigate somewhere that doesn't have an image, right? So let's go ahead and jump into the Bootcamp code. Notice that it's grayed out on my system. That doesn't mean I can't select it or try to select it, but Django itself should actually not allow that to be saved, right? So if I hit save and continue, it's not a valid image. So that's pretty cool, I think. But anyway, so going back into this, let's grab a valid image, and I'll go ahead and hit save. Okay. So now what I should see inside of my CDN test media, hey, what do you know? There is that actual image. So it did upload, and it worked just fine. No big, I don't know if that's like a big mind-blowing experience at all, but it's probably not. But there are a couple things that we can consider to do after we create an image itself. I'm not going to do it, but I will mention the steps that you might take to do it, which is we add another Boolean field for creating a thumbnail, and then in a signal, a post save or post create signal, much like we did in orders, these signals up here, you can actually create a thumbnail in there, right? So you could actually run a signal to create a thumbnail based off of, whether or not you want it to be created. And you would just use that image field and the Python image library. It's actually not that complicated to do all those things, but it certainly can have some challenges associated to it when you're doing it, especially with really large images. So it's not something I'm going to cover right now, but it is something to be aware of. Okay, so now that we've got the image field and we're able to upload it, there's another step I need to do, and that is inside of forms.html. So what happens here when you try to upload an image on the form, let's go ahead and go to products, create. Well, naturally, I need to actually add the field itself. So going back into forms here, I'm also going to add in image and save that. So what happens is this will not be uploaded by default. So we need to update our encoding for the form itself. And you can actually do this on all forms. It doesn't have to be only forms that have data. You can turn all forms into this thing called multi-part form data. So this encoding will then allow your Django view to actually get any files that are related to the form itself. So this now is a lot more suited to actually getting those files. So then actually, how do we actually get those files in a view? Well, it's not as simple as request post. It's pretty simple still, but instead of just request post, we add a new feature here and say request.files or none. Okay, so all that's doing is saying, hey, we're gonna go ahead and accept those files as well. And you could use the model form itself to just save the model, but instead what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to use the thing called request.files of the field name itself. So let's be sure that whatever you use here, this is the field name is image. In forms, that is also the field name. I didn't actually change it in the form itself, which of course you can. So when we actually request those files, we want to get the name of the file input itself, which in this case, of course, it's image. So I can actually say obj.image equals to that image, and that will actually save it and associate it just like we did in the Django admin. Another way to check what the image name is, if we inspect the form input itself, it says it right there, right? So name equals to image. So if it was image 2 or something different, then you would want to, change whatever that is there. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this out with all of those new settings, and I'll say, hello world, some random data, grab an image, and upload it. Okay, so it redirected to a new page or new form. I do see a new product, and hey, what do you know? I've got a new uploaded image. It was the identical image. Notice that there's this attached to it, which is really nice. That actually makes it really, really easy to know that I'm not overriding my old images, because it was the same image, the same file name, and Django helped me out and said, hey, you shouldn't override your old one. So it just appended this random string here. There are things on how to change where it is uploaded specifically. And so I will mention it. I'm just not going to do it at this point. The documentation for image uploads are pretty straightforward. But this right here can be a function itself that can be adjusted on the fly when you're actually uploading things. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so next thing. Now what I want to do is I want to actually add another field in here for my protected media. And this one I'm going to call it media equals to models.file field. And again, upload to. And this time I'm going to upload it to, well, I'm going to leave it in as products. But I actually want to change where it's stored. So I don't want it to be stored in the default storage, which I'll mention what that default is again in just a moment. But I want to move it somewhere else. I want to store it to my, let's see, going back to my settings. Where did that go? I want to move it to this folder, this protected media folder. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's several different ways on how it can be executed. I'm going to show you probably the cleanest and easiest way. So inside of products, what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to make a new file called storages.py. This file is going to just really tell our single field where we want to store this file. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just import a couple things. So from Django.conf, we're going to import settings. No surprise there, probably. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use that protected media setting. So I want to come in here and say protected media equals to get attribute settings and protected media, otherwise none. Okay, so this is obviously the path to wherever that protected media is. And just like the media files, this can be a production server for static files. It could be on S3, it can be on Google Cloud, or Azure has some stuff too. And there's a lot of places to store this. So I also want to have a improperly configured exception. So you'll see this on all kinds of applications if you don't, or third-party packages, if you don't actually set it up correctly. So I'm going to go ahead from Django core.exceptions. We're going to import improperly configured. And I'll just say if, protected media is none, then I'll raise the improperly configured exception and literally say that the protected media is not set in settings.py. Okay. And you might be wondering, well, why am I doing this? Well, several reasons. One of them being that I'm actually going to be using this for sure in one of my fields, right? So if I'm going to be using this for sure, I want to make also for sure that the protected media setting is set. Now, of course, the other option would be to use the default, which is the media root, but we also don't know for sure if that's set. Remember, I set that earlier. So this is just a clean and easy way to do that, and it's something you'll see from time to time. And I actually spelled that incorrectly. It should be get ATTR, which stands for get attribute. And I'm looking inside the settings module for this attribute, and the default, the fallback value in this case will be just none, which is why this is executed if it is none. Now, we already set it, so we won't see that error happening. Okay, cool. So next thing is just from Django.core, we're going to go ahead and do files.storage. We're going to import the file system storage now. So this is the default class for how we store things. So we can augment this default class by saying class protected storage and change that file system storage to being, well, really simple. We just change the location to the protected media. Again, the default location is just media root. All the documentation shows you this. It's like pretty straightforward, I think, but the file system storage is what media root is typically. Django Storages, that package I mentioned, does something like this, but just slightly different. It augments all of that as well. So you would use Django Storages to do this same idea, and then grabbing this, we would actually come into our model itself and do from.storages. We're going to import the protected storage here. And this is now where we'll use it on this media file. We'll go ahead and say storage equals to that class. Okay. So we can also have a function here that has, you know, if it's in, actually I will show you this. So let's go ahead and say debug storage mode. And what it's going to say is if settings.debug, you know, return the protected storage, and we probably want to execute that. And then otherwise we'll return whatever the default storage would be. So that is something that you might actually want to have in here for this storage. So if we're testing things out, that's where you put it. If you go live into production, you would use the live protected storage call itself. Okay. So let's go ahead and say git. How about git storage, you know, location or something like that. Okay, so I'm going to leave that out because I don't have a production version. But now we've got this protected storage here. I'm going to go ahead and change these options. And there we go. We save that. And now again, we want to run python manage.py, make migrations, and python manage.py migrate. And I will say, the cool thing about this, well, there's several cool things about this. One of them being, if we need to change this, it's really not that hard. So if you do change this, every future uploaded file will go to the new location. But I'm actually not sure, this is something worth testing, is if you change this after you've used this for a long time, if it actually updates the old ones or if it uses the new location, which could present a problem, right? So if you were like, for several months, you're like, oh, this is the location I use, and then you decide to change it, does that actually affect all of the old things that you uploaded? I don't know. That's going to be worth checking out. But anyway, so now we've got this file field here. So yet again, in our forms, we can actually come in here and say media, right? So media being the field name itself. And then in our views, we can go ahead and say media equals to request.files and media. And then, you know, obj.media equals to that media. We can also use the get call here. So get request.files is a dictionary, just like request.post, right? So we can do this same sort of thing, or at least I believe so. So if we say if image, then we set the image, and this would mean that we don't actually have to have these things, especially for the media one. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a shot now that I've, you know, really mucked it up a little bit. So let's go ahead and come back in here, re-render this, and I don't think I have the server running. Of course not. Let's run that server, and here we go. Okay, so yet again, I will go ahead and say Django on Docker. I don't know, just some old file that I've got. Okay, so I've got my image file here, and now we're gonna have a protected image file, right? So another YouTube video that I recently released. I'll go ahead and hit send data. Let's go into the admin, go back into products. I have my third product here, and there we go. So we've got our media, and again, same exact image. It changed the string at the end, and then media also says products. You should use parcel.js. So what you're going to notice is on the bottom, it'll say media URL, and actually, if you open that, it's going to go and attempt to open it in the media URL. But of course, it doesn't find it. Now, this is where that key part is, right? So we've got inside of CD and test, we've got our media, those three images, no surprise. And then in protected, we've got that as well. So the, you know, products, they're both in products, right? I did that on purpose. Now, what I will say is a nice challenge for you to undertake later is to change these upload to and have them automatically change based off of something related to the actual instance itself, whether it's the user or something otherwise. I do think that upload to is a cool thing to test on your own. And I think if you are still following along and you're not super lost, I would imagine actually executing that is going to be really easy for you, even if you look on Stack Overflow or whatever you need. Okay, so that actually handles those protected files. We now have a way to upload it. Now, I will say several caveats here. One of the biggest ones is the size, the bigness, the size of these files that you're uploading, right? So if the image is really, really large, or if the media is really, really large, your server may time out. That's one possibility. And it might not be related to Django. It might be related to Nginx or Apache or whatever's on top of actually running your web server itself, or GUnicorn, or a lot of those sort of production grade things. What also might happen is the user itself might, go somewhere else because they don't want to sit here and watch this thing load for hours. They might think that it's not actually working, right? Because in modern web uploads, modern image uploads, you've got some sort of progress bar that shows up here. And unfortunately, using just Django by itself will not give you that progress bar. You need to use something like JavaScript. That is outside the context of this bootcamp itself, but it is actually rather important to use when you actually go in to production, is to use something called asynchronous requests to actually handle this. But it's fine for now, and it's also fine for a lot of projects, and especially if you, the user, if you are the only one that's uploading that main media and that main image. Like if you're the one controlling the products, you don't necessarily have to have the asynchronous part of it working. And realistically, you probably wouldn't even need this create view. You'd probably just use the admin itself to handle all of these things. But of course, I wanted to show you to make sure that you knew how to upload files in there. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, the final question is, how do we actually download files? Okay, so how do we download these orders or these products that I have? So what I'm actually going to do now is jump into orders, and this is where I want to download the product itself. So eventually it will be changed a little bit to have additional permissions, something I'm not going to do just yet. But what I will do is use this login required decorator, and we're going to go ahead and call it define download order. Okay, so it's going to take in a request, and it's going to be args and keyword args. So the goal for this is to literally download our order product media if it exists, right? So if it doesn't exist, obviously we're gonna do something about that. Not produce, but product. So if it doesn't exist, we will absolutely do something about that. So what I need to do is make sure that product is in here. So the first thing I want to do is just say QS equals to product.objects.filter. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say media __ is null equals to false. So I'm only filtering this down for our example. In the future, what we'll do is have a download order, maybe some sort of order ID that actually has a product associated to it. Remember this old thing? So then it would actually go off of an order ID instead of just a random query set like this. So I just really want to make sure that this is working. So before I actually do that, I'll go ahead and say all, and then we'll just give an obj. So our product object, let's go ahead and say product obj equals to qs.first. Again, that lookup will absolutely change. And if product.obj media, or rather if not that media, and again that's that field name, as I'm sure you know, we're going to go ahead and raise HTTP 404. Like this page is not found. There's no way to actually download this. Just future proofing that a little bit. So from Django to HTTP, import HTTP 404 here. Okay. So again, I'm actually not going to be using this, so I'll get rid of that all call. And now I'll just be filtering this based off of whether or not it does have media. So this will literally never be called in this case. Okay, so now that I've got this, this media item here, there's a couple things that we can be aware of. One of them is the actual path to that media object. So if we do media.path, that will give me the path, my local system path to wherever that media is, right? So whatever it is, .csv or whatever you actually uploaded there. that will give me that path. This is actually kind of important for several reasons, which I'll show you in a moment. I'm also going to go ahead and get the primary key of this object itself. So product object .pk, or rather .id. Same thing in this case because I didn't change it. But the reason I'm doing the primary key is I'm actually going to rename the name of the product when I go to download it. So to do this, one of the simplest ways is to use pathlib. So we're going to go ahead and use pathlib. And I'm going to grab from the media path, which will have a file name at the very end. I'm going to grab that file name. And more specifically, I'm going to grab the extension, which in pathlib is actually called the suffix of it. So we'll go ahead and say the suffix equals to pathlib.path of this path here. All right, so yes, maybe that seems confusing, so I'll go ahead and say product path and call it like that, and this will just be the actual path itself. So we'll leave that for a moment, and then I'll go ahead and say my extension or ext is equal to that path dot suffix. Okay, so this will give me like .csv or .png or .mov, right? So it'll give me with the period in there. That's kind of a key part to that. So now I can actually change the file name that I'll end up using by using the primary key and that extension, right? And I can also say, like, I don't know, my cool product dash primary key, and then maybe even have, you know, some order ID in here as well inside of that file name too. So you can really play around with how you rename these files as they download, right? So that means that whatever we upload, it doesn't really matter because we can totally change it for the user download itself. Okay, so now what we need to do is return an HTTP response. Okay, so how do we actually go about doing that? Well, first and foremost, I need to actually bring in HTTP response. So I need to change what kind of response it is based off of the fact that I'm trying to make the browser download this, right? I don't want the browser to render it because in the case of images, the browser will show it, as you might imagine. And then this URL becomes very similar to a media URL. But instead, what I want to do is I want the browser to be like, hey, I know that you want me to download this, so I will go ahead and download this. So first and foremost, we need to open up the file itself. So going off of the path right here, we're going to go ahead and open this up. Okay, so before I continue, what I will say, pathlib itself and open, this is newer things to Python. So if you use an older version of Python, there's a very good chance that a lot of this is not going to work exactly as predicted, right? So pathlib itself, I mean, at least you're using Python 3.6. I think the newer versions of Django are doing this too. So this is one of those things that just, it's really minor as far as how it actually functions. But it also is major if you're not using it, right? If you're using an older version of Django and you're trying to use pathlib, Django might not play well with it in the past. I think 3.1 is when Django started playing well with pathlib. So that's a huge caveat to using this all over the place. So if you have to use OS path, there's absolutely a way to do all of this same stuff with OS path. So yeah, anyways, so with that out of the way, we're going to open up this path and we're going to read it as bytes. And then we're going to call this as F. Now, the reason I'm reading it as bytes is because I want to send it back as bytes. I don't need to read it any other way. So no matter what it is, I'm reading it as bytes. Okay, cool. And that's what that RB mode is if you're not familiar. So now what I need to do is actually put this into a response type wrapper. And this is going to be called file wrapper itself. Okay, so this file wrapper is actually coming from a WSGI package that I believe is installed with Django. It actually might be in Python by default. I'm actually not positive. So WSGI ref.util, we're going to import the file wrapper. So this file wrapper is actually how we'll go about returning our response. So that's going to be this F here. And that is what we'll be doing with the response itself. So we'll go ahead and say response equals to HTTP response, and we're going to pass in that wrapper there. Okay, And well, we probably want to add in the content type itself. Now there's several ways on how we can get content type. When we actually upload this file, a few steps ago, we could set a field on the product itself for the actual content type. In this case, we're going to be using meme types to guess what the type is. You would also use meme type to guess what the type is because allowing the user to choose it is not always the best. So from meme types, we're going to import guess type. So this guess type will just, well, quite literally guess what the meme type is for this particular project. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a default meme type or content type. So let's go ahead and say content type equals to, we're going to set the default of application/force download. Okay. So this will actually suffice for a lot of things, right? So using force download is completely okay, but not every browser is going to respect your declaration to force this to be downloaded. So it's actually better to actually assign a meme type. So I'll go ahead and say guest underscore equals to guess type. And we're going to guess the type of the path itself, which is just going to go really to the file itself. And I believe the way that guess type works, and this is guess, two S's, not guessed. I believe how it works is based off of the extension. I don't actually think it opens up the file and tries to guess the type from there. I think it just goes off the extension and guesses what the meme type of that file is. And we're just going to go ahead and grab, 0, right? The first iteration of this. And basically, we'll say if guessed is something, then I'll go ahead and say content type is equal to whatever was guessed. Okay. So now we have a fallback. The original fallback is this right here. This get type, no exception should happen at all, unless for some reason we don't actually have a product path, in which maybe we should have a condition for that and say if, no path, or let's say path, if not path.exists, that's it. We'll go ahead and raise HTTP 404. Okay. Quick little exception there. It's a good thing we talked these things out. Okay, so you might be like, okay, well now I'm just going to go ahead and return that response. Well, almost. We're almost there. So there's a couple of headers in our response that we need to add. Now, all of these things for so many other applications are done for you. We're doing it the hard way, so if this is uncomfortable for you, I totally get it. It's outside the realm of what a lot of people need to do on a regular basis, but that's not why we learn how to code. We learn to push what our skills are. So with our response, we send back headers. These headers, the browser is going to read and try to make its best guess as to what should happen here. Now, I will say that this should work every single time, but there's always the possibility that it does not work and the browser actually renders the image like we don't want it to, right? So I don't want it to render out an image. I want it to force that download to happen. And the browser is going to decide at the end of the day what ends up happening there, which may or may not be the greatest results for the user. But in my testing, in my experience for years, this has worked really, really well. The reason I'm bringing that up is because it may change in the near future. I have no reason to believe that, but it may happen. So we're going to pass in the header of content disposition. And this header, we are going to pass in with an attachment. And we'll go ahead and say file name equals to, remember that good old file name that we had here? This is actually where we can change that, right? So you can use the original file name by all means, go ahead. But this is actually how we can change the file name to what we want. And we call it an attachment so that the browser knows that you should probably download this. There's another header that's useful, and that is x-send file. And this is capital file like that. And then we're going to go ahead and say, again, the file name here as well. So both of these should actually send the file name, whatever it ends up being, right? Cool. So now let's actually go ahead and test this out. So of course we still need permissions on here, but this should actually download that order for us. So let's go ahead and bring this into my URLs for the main project. Of course, this is from orders, so we'll bring it in from orders, and this is simply just download order. And I'm literally just going to use something like checkout, but just call it download. Perhaps we change that path later, I would imagine we will, but the idea here is just to test out that it actually works. So let's go ahead and try it and go to download, and the server's not running. Why would it be running? Okay, oh, yeah, that's why. I have a little syntax error. Too many quotes there. Sorry about that. And I got project object is not defined. Ooh. What do you call that code? Ah, yes. Project object is not defined, but project object is. That's funny. Okay. So let's make sure. And I also did not define media. Wow. Okay, so media equals to project object dot media. Okay, so we got that product path. Looks like we should be good to go now. Nope. I'm calling it project object. I realized what I did here. So I should be calling it product object. And there we go. So product object, not project object. Always thinking about projects, aren't I? Okay, so now if I refresh in here, my product actually downloads. And if I do it several times, we see that it is actually downloading, and it's downloading based off of what I had before. And now, you know, in your local system, it's going to append an additional number if you already have that in your downloads. But the name itself it's a funny name, but it's certainly working, right? And it's going off of a JPEG, and now we actually have a way to download these products. So what would probably end up happening actually is not that they would directly go to that URL, but rather what they would do, and again, we'll just do a simple little basic link here. You would have a href and some link. So in this case, I'll just say download, and I'll say download here. So that link itself would show up, and then you'd click on that, and that's actually what's going to download. So you wouldn't actually go to the URL itself. But of course, if they copied that link and went to that URL, it would still work. It just wouldn't render anything, as I'm sure you are well aware of when it comes to, comes to actually building web applications or using web applications. Okay, so that's it. Now, there is something that I did want to mention. If you are familiar with Git or you're using Git, what you're not probably going to want to do is have this cdn test go into your Git repo. Now, those of you who are like, what is this git ignore stuff? You can quite literally ignore what I'm doing here. But this is something that I definitely want to not have in my repo itself, because I don't need to bring it into my repo, which is why you are seeing all these crazy numbers over here. I have this on GitHub so you can review the code itself. So that's it. That is actually how you handle private downloads, right? There's really no other way to actually get that download from Django at this point, right? If for some reason you had that entire folder exposed, let's say this entire folder exposed to the outside world, of course they could find this protected file and actually download it. But if they didn't have it, if it wasn't exposed, then they wouldn't be able to do it. Now, in production for me, what I'll often do for something like this is I'll have an entirely different bucket that is on AWS S3 or Google Cloud Storage. I will have an entire bucket specifically for the protected media. Therefore, I know that entire bucket doesn't actually have anything in there. Usually what you'll see with AWS S3 and Google Cloud Storage, when you go to download things, you would actually skip this entire version, this part right here. And what would often happen is they'd actually sign a URL, which is very similar to what we're attempting in this entire view. That signed URL is actually what you would return as an HTTP response redirect to that signed URL. Now that obviously gets a little bit more complicated, but it's certainly something that is worth knowing, right? And worth mentioning here, because you're like, oh, well, I want to use the AWS S3 and I want to use Google Cloud Storage for these production related things. Again, you would actually need to sign the object itself to do that. All right, cool. So that's it for this one. I'm going to go ahead and jump into some Q&A now. I just need to load up a couple things for that. So what'd you think? Did you guys like doing this? Did you enjoy it? Did you get super lost? I think that, you know, one of the challenges of trying to cover a lot of concepts in a short amount of time is you definitely lose some people here and there. But I do think that part of the reason I like doing this really condensed a lot of stuff in there is the rewatches. Then you can really just pick and choose the things that you really want to learn. And if you rewatch it on 2x speed, just to reiterate things, or even 3x speed, just to reiterate things on what it is that I do, it will often jog your memory and make it pretty cool. I do that all the time. Like if I'm rewatching a video that I learned from, you double that speed or triple that speed. I know Dennis Ivey, who has become a friend of mine, he does that a lot too. So he's the reason I thought of that just now, and also one of those advantages of why of me talking super fast. Okay, so I'm gonna be you know, answering any questions that you have now. So please let me know. I see that, you know, I think I have some questions from about an hour ago, but I'm going to actually go off of the questions that are for those of you who are here now. You know what I mean? So feel free to re-ask those questions. I know I kind of encourage you to not ask those same questions over and over again, but please feel free to do that for that. So I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. It looks like a lot of you got something out of this. Yeah, I think. Oh, you couldn't see my taskbar. Sorry about that. I did show the file part. I guess I had the taskbar cut off. So thanks for bearing with me and believing me. It absolutely did download. I promise you that. Maybe I should actually show you the taskbar. I don't know. I guess you don't need to because I did show you the file's results, right? Okay. So let's see if we've got some more questions here. Okay, so how would you track something like a per user upload limit, like having a user with 100 megabytes of storage on your server? Yeah, so what I would do is actually run a job, some sort of worker process. I'm going to be covering worker processes in an upcoming course called Time and Task 2, which I have a Time and Task 1, which you could learn how to do this as well. Those are all on cfe.sh. So you can have a worker process that doesn't really enforce this in real time, because the last thing that you want to do is prevent your user to upload something because you haven't caught up to how much data they have in their storage, right? So a worker process can help solve that. And essentially then you would have a completely other module that, or excuse me, a completely other model that would actually monitor how much storage they've used at this point. And what you can do in the worker process is you can actually literally go through all of the files in their stored directory and calculate what you know, how much data they've actually used in that directory. And that's where that upload to challenge came in, and the file field itself where I said upload to, you can actually change where that goes based off of the user. That is a good challenge to do, because once you do that, then you can actually do what you're asking here. And then basically once you hit that limit and your worker process hits that limit, you have a lot of options here. Now you could prevent them from uploading more, or just alert them that you're going to start charging them more. I mean, that's pretty easy. But of course, if it's a free account and you want to have a hard limit, then that model that's actually tracking it would allow for that to happen. And the reason you do it in a worker process, especially if it's a free user, you could do that like constantly. I mean, every 5 minutes or something, you do it for all your free users. Maybe 5 minutes might be excessive, but you could do it for all your free users to see exactly where they are with that storage. Now, another thing that you could do is literally just calculate the most recent uploaded files. But the problem with that is if they stop the request, the file doesn't actually fully upload, so it won't actually be stored in their system, but it might be stored in your database. So that's my reasoning for you actually go through their folder every once in a while, because of the challenges that might come up with uploading files themselves, right? There are a number of ways on how to solve that, and probably better ways too. But that's the simplest way I think you can do it for the vast majority of you. Simple is not always simple, though, is it? Okay, cool. So how can we have an additional increment integer field for order ID while still utilizing the Django default ID field. So this is really good. So you can use a signal to do this. And I would actually use a pre-save signal and allow the field to be empty. So null equals true, blank equals true, and not have it render anywhere like on, I mean, you could take it off of the admin itself too, but you would also just definitely not have it on any field so a user can implement what that ID might be. And then in that pre-save signal, only one time you just put a condition. If it's empty, then you use a query set to get the count of all of the pre-existing ones. So QS equals to, product.objects.all.count with the parentheses. That will give you a number that currently exists in the database. You can then assign that +1 to that auto incrementing field. That would be a very simple way to do that, and fairly efficient. I'll say that much. So hopefully that helps answer your question here. No option for 3x here. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I think that you did enjoy this. It looks like a lot of you did, so thank you for watching. Yeah. I think downloading and uploading files is really fascinating. One of the things that we didn't talk about with the uploading files is actually handling really, really large uploads. It's just another layer of complexity that we just didn't have time for. We barely had time to cover everything that I did. So I think the download is a lot more important than the upload in this case. Because you, as the owner of your site, the upload is not, you'll be aware of the fact that it's going to take a while to upload, so you can sit there and wait. Okay, so here's another one. How do I add mini pictures like press plus to another field? Is that with JavaScript or with many fields and models? Yeah, so what you'd end up doing, I'm assuming you mean like having a bunch of different images. I think that's what you meant by mini pic. So a bunch of different images associated to any given product. You would actually make the images or the product image as its own model, and have a foreign key to the product itself. So the product image model would have a foreign key to the product, and then that way you can actually have a ton of images for that product, and it can be arbitrary for any product, right? You can have one image, you can have no images, you can have 1,000 images. It doesn't really matter. And then essentially what you would do on the actual create side, the form itself, well, in the admin, there's something called tabular inlines that you can add in to what we have, which gives you a really easy and simple way to add additional fields for a foreign key related model. That probably went over the head of a lot of you, but that's one way to do it. And then the other way would be in your field itself. There's something called model form sets. So you can actually use a model form set and JavaScript, very simple JavaScript, to just copy one of those empty fields over and over again. The form set itself is really not that hard to do. I definitely cover this on my website, cfe.sh, and I think I use jQuery. I don't think I use pure JavaScript, but that's like probably the simplest way to do it without doing too much JavaScript yourself, is to use form sets, and specifically model form sets for the foreign key that you want to add additional files to. But unfortunately, the images themselves, if they're really big, that's going to take a really long time to load up. So you'd probably want to actually use JavaScript for it in the long run, to actually upload and do all of those things. I mean, it adds a layer of complexity. I mean, think about it. Uploading and handling these big files is a lot more complex than just standard data. So it needs something that can help with that complexity. And JavaScript is what runs in the browser, so it allows the user to have a much better experience. That doesn't mean that Django can't do it by itself. That just means that JavaScript adds that user interface experience that you might need, and certainly outside the context of what we're going to be covering the remainder of the bootcamp. So thank you for that question. It's a good one. Adding this to the middleware classes, does it help make the downloads faster? That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer, but it seems like that middleware could do that, especially for certain kinds of really large requests? That's a really good question, though. I would have to look that one up. And if you do look it up, please let me know, because the middleware classes are fascinating for all sorts of reasons. But the gzip middleware, that's not something I've actually used much myself. And maybe it's silly that I haven't, but something I need to look into more. When I say haven't used much, in this case, I've never used it, so I don't have a really solid answer there. But my intuition by looking at it is probably going to speed up some of those bigger requests or bigger responses. But I'm not positive. I would have to look it up. Thanks for that one. Or if you look it up and you find it out, please let me know, because I do want to know that answer, because I serve files from time to time. But actually, the vast majority of the time when I'm downloading files, like when I actually use production download and upload of files, I only use AWS S3 or Google Storage. I haven't used Azure myself, so I really haven't had a solid reason to do that, to switch from these other ones, because it's not that expensive to use AWS or Google Cloud Storage. And both of them are really reliable. So they actually handle all the download speed and all that. So I don't know, take that for what you will. So thanks for the super chat. Appreciate it. I love how you call me Django Stin, because my name's Justin. For those of you who don't know my name, I probably should introduce myself when I get started, but I'm just so used to just, hey, let's dive in, you know? Does it matter what my name is? I don't know. Let's go ahead. Anyways, thank you for the super chat. Appreciate it. I'm glad that you are enjoying this, and others are as well. Did I build my website using Django? Absolutely. Django is the back end, and React.js is the front end, or the most of the front end. So yeah, a Django filter guide would be helpful from you. Super cool. Thank you for the recommendation. Wonder if you're the same person who's been asking me that. Maybe not. Let's see here. So if you're joining now, and you said you joined late, it will be on my channel shortly. So make sure that you subscribe to know about it later, right? So this, I think, I realize some people come to the live stream and they're not subscribed, but it's like, why? Why not? You know? I mean, really, you should be enrolled too. So cfe.sh/enroll to get a lot more than just this, and in a much better package than just, live streaming. Anyways, thanks for the question. It's a good one. Let me refresh here real fast. Okay. How would you use React inside of Django? I have a whole series on this, David. A whole series on tweet. It's called Tweet Me Too. The series itself is called Tweet Me Too. But my phone. But on YouTube, it's create a React and Django project. So you don't really use React inside of Django, other than maybe the template rendering out React. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. So, how to use Django and TypeScript, not with React or Angular, only a TypeScript. Well, TypeScript gets compiled into JavaScript, and this is certainly outside the context of the bootcamp itself. So whatever you can do in JavaScript, you can do in TypeScript for the most part. So you would just convert or compile your TypeScript into JavaScript later. That doesn't need React or Angular to do that. Yeah. Okay. Here's another one. Is Cloudinary good for image storage for Django? I haven't used it, so I don't know. Maybe. I realize a lot of people are like hesitant to use Google Cloud and AWS because there's just so much stuff that's going on in there that it's like, oh, I just want this one thing. And there are services out there that just do that one thing, like images or static files themselves. Cloudinary might be one of those places. I don't know. I've never used it. Good question. Maybe somebody can tell me. Okay, so how do I download multiple images with huge size, say 10 gigabytes? So this is the same thing. You want to actually use a production static file server like AWS or Google Cloud. That will actually allow this to happen. Now, downloading multiple images at 10 gigabytes each, I mean, what Django would end up doing is not actually serving that file like I did. It would actually just give you a redirect to a signed URL, like I mentioned before, that would actually download those files. That is the easiest way to do it on the web, because again, you don't have an app that's installed on their system like you would on your phone, or if you download apps on your computer. If you had that level of control, then it's going to work a little bit differently. And again, Django probably wouldn't be too much involved in that situation. And that's of course where we really think about Django's place in the big stuff like downloading and all that. Is the knowledge from this bootcamp necessary for watching your Tweet Me Too project on YouTube? I think what you'll learn here will be reiterated on that course to some degree, but I'll also cover things that I didn't cover here. So I recommend this bootcamp because it's a newer version of that, like getting feedback from those things, from all the basic stuff. But it's also going into an area that's different. So we have to address different kinds of problems that come up in this one than in Tweet Me Too. But if you do this whole bootcamp and you, I mean, honestly, even that first week, you could probably just jump into Tweet Me Too from that first week or the first 5 days of the bootcamp. But if you watch the whole thing, I think you'll get a lot out of it either way. Thanks for the question. That goes for everyone, obviously. How do you have like multi-tenant applications with Django? This is definitely outside of the relevant questions for today. So yeah, multi-tenant applications in Django is not always the best solution. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so live question. Yeah, so most recent you missed a lesson. Will it stay on YouTube? Yes, it absolutely will. I will definitely have it live on YouTube forever. Extend this bootcamp and cover the Django REST framework. If I do cover the Django REST framework, it's going to be not in this bootcamp. I will say that much. And I'm not positive if I'm going to do more bootcamps, right? So the reason that I'm doing this one was a test. I wanted to see what it was like. There's a lot of production things that happen when you're live that I think take away from what you can learn. I have yet to hear many students saying this. I think the part that is really valuable is this, our Q&As, actually talking after the lesson is done. But I'm not positive if actually doing the lesson live makes that much of a difference. Except for the fact that production issues happened. The other day, the trash collector came and it was super loud. I had to stop live right in the middle of everything. And I want to avoid doing those things as much as possible. But also, like, when I make mistakes, I do love showing mistakes because it's important that you see that I absolutely make mistakes all the time. So I definitely do that in my normal classes as well, the recorded stuff, the non-live things. But those mistakes, I can not necessarily solve them live. There is benefit in solving them live, but there's also not benefit because then I'm like separating out from, oh, I'm teaching now, to being like, what's going on here? Why is this failed? And sometimes it's really, really simple, but if I don't catch it while I'm live, that simplicity becomes very, very frustrating, and it doesn't have a good solution. So for that reason, I'm not sure if I'm going to do live boot camps in the future. So the other thing is, like, if I am doing live boot camps, that means that I'm definitely going to be spending 15-20 minutes answering questions. Would it be better if I spent an hour answering questions based off of a previous course that I just released or something like that? That actually might be the way to do things. We will see. I don't know. I do like going live, though. I have been enjoying this, so maybe there is some hybrid that I can do where maybe I show a pre-recorded lesson that we know for sure how long it's going to take, and then after that we talk. Maybe that's a way to do boot camps in the future. You guys are gonna have to let me know if you like that idea. So yeah. So here's a good one. How do you handle multiple databases in Django? So the Django database configuration, you can have multiple databases there, and then how you do query sets and model managers, you just change it in there. This is definitely a little bit more advanced, but I believe the documentation has that pretty clear. So yeah. Okay, so here's a good question. Did I design this application on paper, or am I just doing it on the fly? Well, I've actually built quite a number of e-commerce projects, right? So I know where I want to go with this, but I will say that I do have notes, right? So I have notes prior to jumping in. So in a sense, I have it on paper from that, but I didn't plan out the entire project yet, right? Like, I don't think there's a whole lot of value in planning out that entire project because I know, generally speaking, where I want it to go. And I just do step by step what needs to happen, and I do some notes for that. We teach it together in the boot camp, finish what we can, and then move to the next day and do the same thing all over again. Because you can actually spend a really long time trying to plan out everything that you want in any given application, and it never works out exactly the way you plan because your planning is just sort of dreaming, right? It's just like, oh, what would be cool of a feature for this, this, and this? Oh yeah, that sounds nice. Let's put that in there. And then you'll just have all of these like amazing features, and then you start to actually build it, and you're like, oh my gosh, that feature that seems simple is going to take 3 months to finish. Maybe we don't need that feature. So what I really like to do is focus on the essence of what the project needs and build around that. That's pretty much it. So go off the essence. The very first thing is, how do we do authentication? Like, what are we going to do for that? Then you go to the next thing. You actually build the authentication, and then you go to the next thing, right? You keep going. Now, of course, in this bootcamp, I had to lay the groundwork with some foundational knowledge prior to being able to start really building. And I'm still actually laying the groundwork for a lot of foundational knowledge before we actually build how I would actually build the application itself. So how I would build it is for more advanced users, right? You have to know a lot of things about Django to actually build it the way I build it. But it's definitely like, hey, what's a feature that we need now? Okay, cool. That's the top of the list. We're going to go ahead and do it. You can generally think about, I don't know, 10 features that you might need. So yeah, anyways, thanks for the question there. It's a good one. Use of sessions in Django. Check out earlier parts of the bootcamp itself. Here we go. So we've got Cloudinary as they have a nice Python API, and their free tier goes a long way. That's great. Maybe it's good for static files. I don't know. Haven't used it. So yeah, perhaps worth a check. Can I do a video about notifications in Django? Thank you for the suggestion. I appreciate it. Okay, so if we don't have any other questions about the bootcamp, I'm going to go ahead and end it. Not exactly early, but definitely not as long as yesterday or day 7. So anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you got a lot out of this. If you did, please let me know. You can always shoot me a tip. This is so funny to say. But, if you ever want to support the channel, just go ahead and hit that PayPal link right there. Or you can always do super chats on any of these live things. And of course, if you actually want to get better yourself, just go to cfe.sh/enroll, and you'll be able to, just really up your game with all sorts of programming, Django, JavaScript, Python, machine learning, all sorts of things there that I think are really, really fascinating and definitely worth a look. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys